Today, a philosophical reflection on the election. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one of those posts covering finance and property news. The other day, I went on Adam Stokes' live show and we discussed the election more philosophically. And here is the copy of the show. Thanks to him for letting me show it here. Enjoy.
And we are live. G'day viewers, I'm Adam Stokes. Welcome back onto the channel where we review the 2025 federal election in Australia with the Labor Party winning big time. I've brought a very special guest on tonight, Martin North, to go over what happened and was it the right decision or the wrong decision. I make this disclaimer: I fully believe in democracy. I support the democratic outcome of this election. It's irrelevant which side I was going for. What I support is the people's choice, and if the people chose left or right or centre or other, I support that choice. Therefore, anything we discuss here is part of our democratic right to speak freely and review what happened. So without any further ado, let's bring our friend Martin North on. Martin, thank you for joining me.
Hi there, nice to be back again, and quite a momentous couple of days, huh?
Did we get it right?
Well, it depends on right or left, I suppose, or whether you mean right or wrong. There was this little nicety, right? So you remember this before the election, you know, two cheeks of the same bum. What I would say now is that we have a rather shrunk blue bum.
I've got, what's interesting in this space is I hosted the election live as we were counting the votes, and it only really took about 2 hours. And what was interesting, there was only about 7 million votes counted when the decision was final, per se. We'll go over some stats, but what was interesting, I just want to put things into perspective for us to set the scene and the audience, and then we can explore as philosophers and political commentators together. It seems that in the YouTube world and online, people are more right-leaning, whereas on mainstream television with sponsored media and centralized media, I would argue, it seems to be more left-leaning. And consequently, in the world of YouTube and X, or old Twitter, there seems to be a lot of outrage. But I'm trying to check my own data here. It's like, well, is it just because I'm within this bubble and those who are on the mainstream bubble, they think, well, this is very natural? When it comes to understanding culture, are we seeing now two different cultures of those who live in the world of the internet and those who live in the world of the mainstream, or are they coming together? What's your take on this?
Well, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, because you remember the algorithms, right? There are very strong algorithms, whether you look at YouTube or whether you look at Twitter or wherever else, right? And those algorithms tend to reinforce what you actually spend time looking at. So I don't think the internet is one space. I don't think Twitter's one space. But what I do think is that people tend to see stuff that reinforces the opinions that they already have. And I think that's what's been going on. The algorithms have got quite aggressive. And so you have to work quite hard to actually see a bit more broad. So, for example, I've created a couple of different profiles on Twitter, and I've deliberately trained one to be, if you like, what I think probably is right, but I've also got another one which I think not right and left, but you know, right is appropriate. But I've also got another one to try and actually tell me a little bit about what other people are seeing. And it's fascinating just how different those worlds are. So the algorithms are driving everything. It's just worth an aside. Did you see that Mark Carney, a new Canadian Prime Minister, has just announced that he's concerned about social media, and he's talking about the big US companies being, you know, a propagation of criminal activities? They're going to clamp down on it. There's a real question, to my mind, about freedom of speech and social media and stuff. And guess what? We're going to see, I think, probably a focus on trying to sort of narrow the aperture so people have less diversity of view. My view is this should be a town square where anybody can say what they want, and everybody should be accepting of that within the realms of, you know, being kind and what have you about what's going on. But the fact of the matter is, people have got all caught with regard to this, and a lot of people are calling out, you know, fixes and it's a con, etc., etc. But you know, the data is the data. We're going to talk about why the data is the data, and the consequences and implications. And in fact, I made a show yesterday, which I'm just going to switch to now, which is just called a bigger, more taxed, less housed Australia incoming ? Right? Because that was my sum up of what I think we're going to see as a result of what we saw yesterday. It's got a big showing actually on YouTube when I put it up yesterday, and there are consequences coming from this election result, and those consequences are going to significantly move the dial on some fronts, but on other fronts, it's going to be the same old, same old. And I think that actually at the end of the day, this is very much what we've seen, we'll continue to see, which isn't necessarily good for some parts of society. But if you're a property investor, if you're a leveraged property investor, then you're going to be loving it, because of course prices will go up and people are going to be able to borrow more and the banks will love it. So yeah, this is why I'm saying it's hard to sort of give it a right or a wrong answer. Depends where you are, depends which cohort you're in. But I want to highlight that there are a bunch of people, particularly in the rental sector, particularly those who are struggling with cost of living pressure, et cetera, they're really going to struggle over the next little while. And I would remind you that the inflation rate is low only because Chalmers has dipped into the public purse, as it were, our taxpayer money, and has thrown that by way of subsidy into things like electricity bills and rent assistance and et cetera, right? That's why inflation is lower. It is not necessarily good, because what it is doing is effectively just upping the deficit.
I'm glad you mentioned Canada before. Yesterday, I was talking on my channel about a belief, an allegation that perhaps Trump's effect on the world, the way he entered politics, going very fast and hard with the tariffs, very aggressive, perceived or actual against the world, it actually resulted in many nations of the Commonwealth and the West, in fact, just pushing back and saying, wow, we don't want to have any part of this. And there is several articles that, first of all, in Canada that had their election recently, because Trump went so hard and so aggressive, arguably particularly against Canada and Mexico, the consequence was that an election that may have gone to the right was actually swung to the left. Equally, we can see that news reports are now coming out that perhaps that happened in Australia. In my mind, I think Labor would have won anyway, but perhaps it did push some people away from the right or the centre right or just the centre and over to the left. What are your thoughts? Is it Trump's fault?
No, I don't think it's Trump's fault. I think it's fundamentally, it was a vote against rather than a vote for. Dutton was unelectable. It became clearer and clearer as the election campaign ran on. The policies were ill-formed, and of course there were some back switches. There was a lack of clarity around so many critical things. And in fact, of course, as this particular tweet just said, of course, remember also a lot of people own property, right? So a lot of people were actually benefiting from the high property prices. And Albo was saying, well, we're never going to actually dial back negative gearing and what have you. But Dutton was talking about migration lower, et cetera. So there were a bunch of, but I think it was a vote against primarily. Secondly, I would say that the Trump connection is quite interesting. So Carney got into Canada a bit surprisingly because he was very strongly opposed to the Trump trade tariff agenda, and the polls moved quite quickly and he got in. It's interesting, of course, because in Canada there's been a huge housing pressure crisis. They've dialed back migration to try and deal with it, and I suspect that some of these more central issues will now come back. And the question is, will the Canadian government be able to deal with more than Trump? Will they be able to deal with housing affordability and all of those other functioning questions? Or will it just be a Trump connection that drives what Carney does? There's a broader agenda than just Trump. So Trump marginally, but actually Dutton wasn't even Trump-like.
Where did Dutton get it wrong? In my mind, I have to admit, I was actually following American politics more closely than I was Australia's political campaign. And of course, this is where I was tripping up during a live stream, and even yesterday, of course, we say this to the world, that in America, red is right and blue is left, whereas in Australia, red is left and blue is right. Equally in America, the liberals in Australia, the Liberal Party, are on the right, but in America, liberals are left-leaning. So
Confused? You will be.
Absolutely. So I say this to the world because we do have a global audience. If you get confused with red and blue and liberal and non-liberal, that's where it gets. We're basically just the opposite to the United States. But bringing this back to old Dutton, now that I've cleared up the mistakes that I will make, saying left and right and blue and red. Where did Dutton go wrong? In my mind, what I first saw was the biggest backflip that really threw me off. Not that I was a particularly lover or hater of either side of politics. The truth is, I was so centered. I wasn't really sort of taken away by the left or right in this political party and this political election. I wasn't really leaning either way. I wanted something different is what I really wanted. And the illustration that you showed before was, two cheeks to the same bum. Many people have said two wings to the same bird. And I really see that. I don't see a big distinction. But watching what I saw with Dutton, the thing that when I thought, oh, he's lost it now, was when he did the backflip on saying, okay, we want public servants to come back to work. You can no longer work from home so freely. We want you to come back to work. And then within like a few days or even hours, it felt like he went on national television and said, oh, no, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. And I remember seeing on, I think it was some morning show like Today or Channel 7's morning show. I don't know. They're all the same to me. But the host said, do you owe Australian women an apology? And I'm like, what? It implies that only women work from home. It implies that there's no men in the public sector. And it implies that it was like the mainstream media really sort of hammering this guy to say, you owe women an apology. Your take on that?
Yeah. So I agree that the backflips didn't help, and there were several. I believe that the policy was very flimsy and made up on the fly. And some of it just didn't make a lot of sense when you actually looked about it. But here's the real killer, right? This is a slide I'm going to put up now. This is the Metro Sydney. And remember that red is a Labour. The problem was that Dutton wasn't focusing in on those inner suburban and metropolitan seats. He'd almost written them off, I think, and said it wasn't even worth getting poll data on them because they just couldn't win them. So the question was, who is he actually focusing on? And where is the policy going to? And if you would think that Howard had a very broad church, so he had a very broad range of people that he appealed to, from relatively affluent through to the battlers. Howard had a message that was broad enough. Dutton's message was narrower and narrower and narrower. And of course, he's also shackled to the Nationals as well, that are very much sort of out of the suburban areas. Little Proud, I think, was responsible for the nuclear strategy, which is an interesting observation in itself. But we ended up with not a broad church, but a pinnacle, a steeple, right? A very narrow platform. And I'd make the point that it wasn't where the big numbers are either. So there was, I concluded about 3 months ago, it was very unlikely that Dutton was going to be able to get into power. Simply because I didn't see where the platform was coming from would take him there. But the other point that I want to highlight is we don't have first past the post. We have these compulsory voting, and then we have these preferences, right? And what it has meant is that because the Liberals in particular did so badly, the preferences moved very differently to normal. That's why the Greens got absolutely hit over the head with a 4x2. Band may not get back. Our preference system is actually not necessarily giving us a good sounding as to what really the outcome of what people are thinking really is. They'll probably have about 34% of the primary vote when it's all settled, give or take a little bit, right? And they'll probably end up with 55% of the preferred votes through the preference processes, which is quite a big proportion. And they'll probably end up with 90 seats or so, which is a big number. But they don't represent the majority of the population of the country. And that's, by the way, the same as in the UK, where we had a landslide victory as Starmer, with about 36% of the electorate voting for him. So unfortunately, we have a situation where democracy doesn't mean that the bulk of the people get what they want.
So who ultimately wins here? You can see in leading up to, well, obviously Labor won, and those who vote for Labor won.
Yeah.
But I spoke to many political leaders and candidates who had the hat in the ring, and my question was who was in charge. And I couldn't help to think that during the celebrations of those in the Labor Party room during the victory speeches, and all the volunteers and those who believe deeply in Labor, fantastic. And again, democracy, they did very well. But the sinister side of me, and after reading books such as Confessions of an Economic Hitman and listening to political leaders and being alive long enough to see what the power of money, I couldn't help to think that there was these very, very powerful rich men in boardrooms drinking 100-year-old whiskey and cheersing to each other, saying, "We got it." Am I too evil and sinister in thinking that way, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I always believe in the Cockup Theory of history rather than the conspiracy theory of history, though sometimes they get quite close. But remember, Andy, you had him on the channel a couple of times talking about the fact that the big corporates were actually paying money to both sides of politics to ensure that things got the way they wanted. This is a result which a lot of them will actually celebrate. So big corporates will like this. The banks will like this. The banks will be free to lend more because there'll be more demand for property, et cetera, et cetera. So, like it or not, there are some winners. And the winners, I think, are probably some of those corporate players. Already there are calls out, let's build more houses, et cetera, et cetera. The difficulty, of course, is trying to understand what it really means down on the ground. And I come back to my earlier point. We've got, in my surveys, 70% plus of those in the rental sector struggling with cash flow. We've got half of those people with mortgages struggling with cash flow. We've got 2/3 of people owning property, 1/3 renting, and we've only got about 100,000 people, maybe 150,000 first-time buyers who are likely to buy in the next year. So if you're thinking of just the pure numbers from a maths perspective, clearly you're going to focus on the big numbers rather than the small numbers. And so part of this is that's what Albo did. I think the Albo's strategists were actually quite clever in the way that they executed, and they were very methodical and very structured. And actually, compared with the chaos of Dutton, they were streets ahead in terms of their sophistication, their ability to get their messages out. Also, the other point, did you note how Albo allowed some of his other front benchers to speak and to be part of the conversation, whereas Dutton was very presidential and very narrow in terms of hardly anybody else really stood up much. And even Sukkar, who of course lost his seat, the housing spokesman for the opposition, didn't get back. I don't think he was that credible, frankly, when he was actually being interviewed, which didn't help. And even Shalom Ather from Greens, for the housing spokesperson there for the Greens, also lost his seat too. So it is interesting that of the three major sort of parties and their housing policies, only one of them got in, right? Which I think is quite fascinating. So going back to your broader point, I'm not sure it's as sinister as a dark room and people actually pulling levers, but I do think that you could say that there was some winners in terms of corporate land and some losers in terms of elsewhere. And at the end of the day, we'll probably never know the full story, but there's a lot of money from the unions, of course, in there too. And the story, of course, is that where was productivity in all of this, right? So the thing that's missing, the missing element in the discussion through this campaign and now, productivity improvement. We have to get productivity improvement if we're to actually generate more income, because households are continuing to go backwards. And there's almost no talk through the campaign about productivity. And whilst Chalmers did say post the election that the first term was inflation, focusing on that, the second one will include productivity and a bit on inflation, there's no policies on productivity improvement. So I don't know where we're going to get any real improvement in the standards of living for ordinary people. We're going to get more migrants. Migration is going to come through, clearly. We're not going to see anything in terms of changing the negative gearing or capital gains tax. So property prices will continue to bubble higher, and that's going to allow those people with property to benefit. And in fact, I don't know whether you saw this, but I'm just going to put this up because this is quite funny. This is actually from I just did a show with my friend Just Think Property, Edwin, and he said Australians still believe there are two major parties. Yeah, I know. And many are also convinced we want properties to be affordable. Glad Peter was a sport and did as you told him. Now, that's just a bit cynical, but I quite like that idea, right? That there are people who are actually wanting to see the property story. Did Dutton deliberately walk away from it knowing that it wasn't going to be possible? I don't know. That's what some people are speculating. But at the end of the day, what I can say is Dutton's party was a mess. The Labour Party had their buttons tightened and were doing a reasonable job of policy. But the policies themselves stink in many regards, in my view.
It's interesting because when I was speaking to Senator Rennick, he was talking about the independents, and he said they need to be more polished. And at first I didn't really, I really thought of Pauline Hanson, and I thought, her accent and the way she speaks, nothing against her. It just doesn't sound perhaps as astute as others who speak. But then I thought, well, maybe Albanese doesn't sound as astute, and neither did Julia Gillard. So I'm not sure. But you raise a good point when you see how refined the Labor Party is, that they seem to be very drilled, as in experienced.
It's a machine. It's a machine.
Yeah, perfectly said. It is a well-oiled machine.
And I'd make the point, they're not allowed to go off-piste.
So who sets the script? The leader of the Labor Party? Who's in charge?
Well,
is it Albo in charge?
It'll be the campaign, but yeah, ultimately it'll be the
or is it the lobbyists that are in charge?
No, I don't think the lobbyists are in charge. I think that they know that they're going to be fine. So,
what threw me off is, as you're talking, I'm writing a lot here. I've got all these questions. There's so much I need some clarity on. What didn't make sense to me, Uncle Martin, in this instance, is, again, I was not moving to the left or right. I really wanted change, and I couldn't see change amongst any of them. But also, again,
hang on. Quick question: do you believe that democracy is anyway set up to allow change to happen?
Oh, that's a deep question. Yes, I do.
You do? Okay.
And so I'll tell you why.
I will argue that for 200 and something years, the way that democracy has evolved is designed to stop change happening. It's designed to maintain the status quo. It's designed to ensure that those corporates and everybody else who likes the way the world is work, it maintains that integrity, right? It's very unlikely that in a democracy we're going to see real change. That is part of the problem, that the whole democratic process is predicated on stability, right? Now, the problem is that quite often the voices for change don't come from the center, from the major parties. It tends to come from, little things that happen off center initially, and eventually perhaps they begin to percolate through. The Senate, by the way, is still possibly a cauldron where change could happen, but of course the Greens probably will have a bigger sway there. I don't think the way democracy works is designed to wrought change. It's designed to try and act very strongly in the center. And if you go back to my two cheeks of the same bum, the fact is that both sides have very similar policies in many ways. There were marginal differences. Neither was actually about substantive change, which we need. Neither raised the productivity question, which is a fundamental question for Australia. Neither discussed tax reform, which we absolutely need in Australia. And neither really wanted to tackle the fundamental question of the mixture of society and migration, all those things. It was always like, oh, I don't really want to talk about that much. And even Dutton pedaled back on some of the things he said earlier. So I don't think democracy is necessarily predicated on facilitating change.
Let's do a thought experiment. So I concur that the way it's designed at the moment, it appears that we can't break away from the two major parties. And that was the number one question I asked all my political guests. I say, why is it that we had a prime minister election debate posed to us as a presidential election debate where you had two candidates on the stage. Now, everyone agreed that no, it doesn't have to be Labor or Liberal. So at least by design, we could have the possibility of someone else getting in. And now I'm going to refer to the United States. Although it's more of a republic, in its core, it's about voting someone in to lead the country. What we could see is that when the system, the machine went too far left, like too far, there was significant pushback. Now, people say Trump is extreme, but I would say that the radical left was extreme. As soon as you started genital mutilation of children, as soon as you started degrading women and calling women nothing but chest feeders and birth givers, as soon as you eroded the definition of a woman, as soon as you eroded borders, it went so far the other way that even the establishment itself couldn't stop Trump because it went too far the other way. They even tried to murder the guy. Now, this isn't a pro-Trump thing. It's just an example of, in a form of democracy, albeit a republic, it allowed it to swing back. What was concerning to me in Australia is that you could see that irrespective of how many people came forward to try and vote, they were just wiped out by the machine that is the Liberal and Labor Party. And then the Labor Party, which itself is so united because it's one party, as opposed to a coalition of parties, hence the coalition, it shows the strength of the Labor Party. I wonder, though, if the Labor Party went too far left, like too extreme, is the system that we've got in place, is it capable of saying, no, the people are rising without violence, but with just a voice per se, and putting the votes forward? I don't know if it could happen in practice, but in theory, I believe it could. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think an extreme set of policies on the left or the right probably wouldn't resonate sufficiently well with Australians. But there is a lot of middle ground within the sort of the field of play that allows people to sort of, shift a little bit and appear to be and to sound a little bit left, a little bit right. When you actually look at their policies, I come back to the same point. 80 to 85% were pretty much the same, right? There was no fundamental change on productivity, no fundamental change on tax reform, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? These were marginal things around the edge. Now, housing, of course, a few things like that. But the substantive issues that we should be talking about, which is how do we grow the economic base of the country? The economic base of Australia's got narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower, houses and holes, as I've said on several occasions before. How do we turn that around? How do we grow the broader economic base? Unless we do that, we're going to continue to slide down the international comparisons of prosperity, and if we're not prosperous, we can't then afford to pay the things we want to pay for in terms of healthcare and support for the community, et cetera, and what I found fascinating, there was a survey done a month or so before the election, which basically said that the electorates were quite happy for the government to spend more money to support them. They have a view that the government is there to provide support. Now, that's a hangout from COVID, where of course we had a lot of money thrown into the pot. But what we are actually saying there is, well, we don't mind if there's a huge deficit then. Well, except of course that deficit costs. That means that more and more of the taxpayer funds that we've got goes to pay the interest to the big end of town, going back to who's in charge. And maybe the big end of town is in charge because, of course, they're actually receiving the interest payments on all that debt that's being written. So we have some fundamental structural issues in Australia that nobody through the election campaign wanted to talk about. None of the policies from pretty much anyone really got close to dealing with those issues. So there is still some latitude within that middle ground. Whether the checks and balances are sufficiently strong, so if you had a really rabid right or left wing, maybe, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that would actually fly in Australia. And it's interesting, of course, that if you take, I think Germany, the right wing party there is being sort of excised as not being, allowable within the democratic system. So it's another little observation there on the way that the centre ground is often protected.
And I've got Some questions here were just some quick ones. Did Rennick, do we know if Rennick and Andy Schmulo, did they get in the Senate seat?
So I don't know that we got the final results for Rennick or indeed for the Citizens Party. I think it'll be another couple of weeks before all of that's done, because of course it's all about where the preference flows flow to, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think I saw a tweet from Rennick saying he got a reasonable set of votes sort of first, but it would take a couple of weeks for it to crystallize, and he wasn't necessarily 100% confident, but hopeful, sort of thing.
Slick Dick says, can you please ask him, I think it means you, is the e-safety woman, what do we call her, the e-Karen, is she already changing our experience on YouTube and the like?
Yeah, so there is no direct intervention, but there is influence. And if you look at the way that the social media companies are actually behaving, what they're doing is marginally tuning their algorithms to sort of try and follow the sort of the direction. But there's no specific interventions that I've seen yet. It probably will come. Wouldn't be surprised to see further attempts to silence social media, like Canada, from Albo in this term. Remember, he tried last time and failed, and ended up with this age limit strategy. Now, if you think about the age limit strategy, when it comes in, does it mean that everybody will have to prove their age? And if that's the case, then that would be an example of direct intervention.
What I don't get, Martin, is if we go back over the last 3 to 4-ish years, there was 4 major reforms that were put forward or suggested that didn't go through and really made Australia come together and say, hang on, this is BS. We say no. So first of all, we had the referendum that was overwhelmingly a no from the country.
This even is on the Voice?
On the Voice, yes.
Yes.
Where basically, I'll put it in my words, where there was a set of rules for this group of people and a set of rules for that group of people. And that's how it was one way or another perceived by the people. And they said, no, we're one country under one flag, sometimes under 3 flags, and we say no. So that was a big thing to say, no, we don't agree with you, Labor, it's out. The next one was, actually, we'll go back a step before that. We had the cash ban.
Yeah.
Was that under Labor?
No.
Okay, so I can cross that one out. So then we had the MAD bill, the mis and disinformation bill, where what you just touched on there, where Canada looks like it's going to lean on it heavily. Perhaps Labor will come in again and say, right, we determine what truth is, we determine what you can hear, we determine who gets to speak, whether it's us or banks or universities or media.
And just on that, it will be dressed up as protecting kids. Okay, it'll be dressed up as criminals playing upon people. That there will be things said to try and justify it. It won't just be straightforward. It'll be, dressed up as something else, like it was last time. That is what they tend to do, because the bottom line is they don't like having such open conversations. They don't. This conversation would not be one they would want to actually want people to see, right? Because we're asking some quite important questions and quite critical questions, right? Now, I would argue that as long as we stay within, decency, and we don't start chucking, accusations all over the place, which we're not doing, our ability to discuss what is democracy and how democracy actually is manifested, and whether the policies that are actually being spoken about are sensible for Australia or are there better ones, those are conversations we should be having as a nation, because it's so critical to our future. But actually, the government doesn't want us to have those conversations. The governors, really, the government wants us to sort of think, pat you on the head. Don't worry, little kiddies. We'll look after you. We'll support the inflation rate. We'll pay down some of your student debts. Just carry on. Just keep on paying the taxes, right? They don't want us to question. And that's my problem. That's why I fundamentally believe that despite what E. Karen is saying, and despite all of the stupidity, we need to have the ability to be able to discuss these things without constraint. Unfortunately, that's going to be more difficult ahead, I think.
I just have to do some housekeeping. Verifier, I've got to ban you. You've insulted someone within the community. The rules are very clear here. We can talk, we can debate, but insults and abuse will not be tolerated. So Verifier, you've made some good comments, but you've You've insulted and attacked one of my subs. Therefore, I'm banning you from the comments and from the community. It's a straightforward rule for everyone. Abuse will not be tolerated. If you can't talk without insulting, you're not welcome here. And as Martin just said here, we're just exploring where we are at the moment. So let's move on. So again, going back to Labor, we saw that the referendum was a big no. We saw the MAD bill was a big no. And then what's interesting with tax on superannuation, I don't know how anyone would be happy with that, except for those who don't understand money and say, oh, it's only for the mega rich. So the past history shows that there were some very big things that Labor did that really upset Australia, and in fact brought Australia together to say, no, we won't tolerate this. This will lead into the second part of the question. The mainstream media is already saying that Labor is likely going to be in, that they did so well this election that it's almost guaranteed that they're going to win the next election. And I'm like, well, hang on a second. How we haven't even started this term, and you're already calling the next election in nearly 4 years' time. Now, we have seen in the past, John Howard, he had 4 consecutive terms. Martin and I had to check this off camera. 4 consecutive terms, John Howard of the Liberal Party. That's correct, isn't it? This is when I was a kid. He did 4 consecutive terms and saw all those terms through to the end. So probably the most successful prime minister in history for Australia. When we come over now to what Labor is going to do, they were in power at last. They're in power now, but the mainstream media is saying, well, they're almost certain to win the next election, which is in 4 years' time. Noting that there was some very big combined pushback on some of these big policies, and when they're now already calling it for the next election, does this suggest that it's guaranteed that the mainstream media is correct because they set the narrative and they indoctrinate the people? Or what are your thoughts?
Well, of course, remember that all the mainstream media, from the ABC through to the newspapers, they all have a particular slant and a particular agenda of their own. So there is no such thing as objective media reporting, right? Everybody has a slant. Everybody has a particular way of doing it. Now, some like the BBC will try and sort of keep balance. But I have to tell you that most of the written media don't. And therefore, when you read what they're reading, what they're writing, they have an agenda. So it's worth asking what their agenda actually is. The truth is that given the low number that is likely to come through for the more conservative side of politics, and whether that's the LNP or whether they break apart, I wouldn't be surprised to see them break apart for a period of time. It's very unlikely that they can capture enough seats. The swing would have to be huge to be able to get back. But like I said, this was a vote against rather than a vote for. So if in fact there emerged, I don't know, a President Kennedy type leader, going back in history in the US, that came into Australia on the more right side and was very charismatic and was really talking a lot of sense to a lot of people, it could swing back. So I would argue that it's a little unlikely if we play the game the way the game has been played for the last 20 odd years. And the game has been very bad for ordinary Australians over the last 20 years. Democracy has not worked in Australia for the last 20 years. We have not got a good outcome for ordinary people. That's the fact of the matter. But unless we see significant and comprehensive alternative policies coming on the table, then we're going to muddle around this central core. And if we muddle around this central core, then it's unlikely that they'll be able to get back, which means that Labor gets a third term, probably.
Do we need to become a republic?
I'm not sure that's going to make a huge amount of difference. The democracy in the UK is about as bad as in Australia, right?
Well, I'm thinking, first of all, a Bill of Rights, and second of all, what I didn't like in Australia is that we can fire our prime ministers over. Well, hang on, I can't find the prime minister, but we think we're voting for a prime minister, but we're actually voting for a party, and we can see this in the past where we had this rotating doors of prime ministers. You'd wake up in the morning, there'd be a new prime minister. It's like, I didn't see the election. So I'm wondering, do we move to a republic for 3 reasons? One is the concept of a monarchy outdated. And just philosophical questions, I don't know. Is the concept of the highest person in the land, the Governor General, someone who's not elected and can fire the Prime Minister? That has happened in the past. Is the concept of pledging our allegiance to an island on the other side of planet Earth, who arguably enslaved us and brought us here as convicts? Do we remain committed to that? I don't know. Some people are very committed to it, and I fly the flag proudly in my studio here, and I've served with great pride, and I've had my commission certificate signed by the Governor General, and I'm very proud of that. But I know many people push back from that situation. And also, do we have a situation where prime ministers can be sacked overnight? We have no Bill of Rights. We wear someone else's, if you will, Union Jack or flag within our own flag. Is this concept outdated? Do we need to move forward? Do we need to break away from it?
I think it's probably, there is merit in breaking away. I've always believed that Australia should steer its own path rather than be shackled to a failing Western power in the Northern Hemisphere that doesn't know what it's doing either. But I don't believe it's a fundamental question for the future of Australia. Australia could lay a track if it set its policies in a different direction without needing to be a republic first. So to my mind, it's like a Venn diagram. There's some overlap, but to me, it's not the most critical issue on the table. In fact, if I was given the choice of a set of policies relating to being a republic or a set of policies relating to tax reform and productivity, the latter is way, way, way more critical for Australia's future than the former, in my view.
Someone asked me to change the banner from blue to grey. I thought, fair enough. I've just changed the scrolling banner down the bottom. It was probably political having it blue. I didn't even think about it. It was just for those who aren't watching, I've got just a little ticker rolling down the bottom, and it was in bright blue. And someone said, "Can we not have it blue?" And I thought, yeah, fair enough. So I've just changed it grey. Look, many people have been asking about China. If you're comfortable talking about it, so. Step one.
Just before we go on to China, I just want to, you touched on the superannuation reform. Let's just unpack that slightly, because this is a really critical linchpin issue, right? So the concept was 2 years ago, Labor proposed that they would actually, for superannuation balance over 3 million, basically say, we are going to calculate each year the value growth in that portfolio, and we're going to charge you tax on the growth of your portfolio, whether you sell anything or whether you don't. So it's actually based on the capital value rather than actually, normally when you're taxed, you only tax when you sell or buy on the capital gains. So they're imputing capital gains on the amount that you hold year on year, right? As a way of grabbing extra tax. Now, that was something that's been done in a few other countries around the world. And it's a way of effectively opening the door on the whole idea of taxing asset growth rather than income from when you sell. So you could extend it further, for example, to housing. So you could say, well, okay, I'm going to actually value your house each year. And when the value of your house goes up, I'm going to tax you on that, right? That's the problem. So that was blocked by pretty much everybody else. But now, of course, with the significant number of additional members that Labor has, they will bring it back. And my concern is that the 3 million, which sounds a lot in today's terms for a lot of people, that's not going to be inflation indexed. So over time, that 3 million is going to come down and down and down in real terms. And they also have the capacity to extend it to other types of assets too. So that once the principle of taxing an asset rather than taxing the income from a sale or a transaction, you've moved into a whole new world. And you can just see where this is going to go. This is going to go into where you're going to get taxed for more. And every time assets go up, what happens then, of course, if they go down? Oh, they probably won't give you a refund. So this is a mad, bad policy, but it's one that we're probably likely to see now get voted through in this term. I think it's a bit of a disgrace. And again, this was not something that was really adequately discussed during the campaign. It was lately discussed, but I made a show about a month ago talking about the unrealized tax issue and how critical this was. And frankly, I'm disgusted by the whole concept.
Do you think, before I go into China, did immigration win the election for the Labor Party?
Well, the policy from the from Dutton was very unclear, right? He sort of messed around with his numbers. So, I mean, he made a few statements earlier on which were quite significant. But later on it became weaker and weaker. And which types of people are you talking about, and which visas are you allowing? And it was very difficult. I think it was incoherent, and that's why I don't think that either of the major parties really were talking seriously about immigration, migration cuts. And the fact is, the only thing that's supporting Australia at the moment is more people coming in, because more people spend more. As a result of more people coming in, they spend more, and that actually helps to keep the economy ticking over, even if it's weak. But it is quite fascinating when you actually look at the retail sales. This is actually a slide which I'll show you now. This is the retail sales volume per capita. And what's fascinating is that whilst the top level retail sales that just came out wasn't great, per capita, it's going backwards again. And that's the reason, right? Because basically what it means is that we have more people, but the amount they're spending is not growing. So effectively, as this one says, they can't cut migration because it will destroy the house of cards. It will destroy the demand for property. It will destroy the retail sales and everything else. So pump away. And I believe that we're going to see a big Australia, much bigger than ever before, simply because that's the only choice. And remember, the forward projections from various sources are we're going to have, something the size of a Melbourne or a Sydney over the next 15 years, or maybe even less. Where they're going to put them all, how they're going to put the infrastructure in place to support them all, where they're going to live, how they're going to get around. None of this is being thought through. So this whole big Australia migration issue is madness, absolute madness. And we're not building enough. The 1.2 million homes will be not enough. We've already had a couple of million, the last few years, and more coming. So to my mind, this was another classic example of neither side of policy really wanted politics. Neither side really wanted to discuss this issue.
You've covered that in great depth on your channel. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and learnt a lot. And some of the data is very alarming. And this is where I see it as a Ponzi scheme, because if you don't have new buyers buying into this, the whole house of cards will collapse. Now, in the past, some people on my channel have said that
the other Ponzi scheme, of course, is you give people a 5% deposit threshold and allow them to get in earlier again. That's another Ponzi scheme, right? And what it's doing is actually giving people a chance to get in. But who's taking the risk? Well, the government's taking the risk on that. They're replacing the lender's mortgage insurer. So this is another classic example of it. Sounds good in theory until you think it through, and then you think, well, hang on a moment, we're supporting the Ponzi scheme again.
Well, I can't remember if it was you or one of the political candidates I interviewed. They said, no, this 5% scheme of getting first-time home buyers, it's not giving them an opportunity. It's dragging them into the system. It's dragging them into being debt slaves. So on the surface, it's like, hey, look at us. We're helping you get this home. But in reality, it's like, no, you're now our bitch. We've now got you. You're in the system.
Remember that you are a cash flow. From the bank's point of view, you are a cash flow if you borrow particularly. So they want you to borrow more, and they want you to borrow for longer, and they want you to borrow for multiple purposes. And that's why the financial system is a leech on the economy, because it's forcing people to spend more and more of their income just to get somewhere to live, or just to borrow for this, that, or the other. This is not good, productive economics, right? What it does do is it inflates the value of the banks, it inflates the value of property, and it allows the Ponzi scheme to continue. Huge amounts of debt is a bad thing. It really is a bad thing. And I'm a great believer in you need to get a mortgage to get a house, okay. But unfortunately, people are so leveraged up, 50% in some cases. There was an article I saw recently that said in some parts of Sydney now, 53 or 54% of the typical income is required to be able to actually pay for a typical property in and around that part. And actually, interestingly, Adelaide was the second worst. Melbourne was slightly better at 36%, I think, of average income, but remarkably high and unsustainable. So unfortunately, the debt machine, which I've regarded as the big corrupt center of the problem, is getting bigger.
What happened to the Green Party? So the Greens used to have, I don't know, perceive so much power. They seem to have this big position in Parliament where they could.
We need to separate Senate from the lower house.
Yeah, concur.
Right. The Greens will probably.
Where are Greens?
The Greens will probably get back with 6 in the Senate. Probably.
Okay, what happened to the House of Reps?
That's where they failed. So we had Bant and we had a couple of others, including the housing spokesperson. In fact, there was an article that popped up here, which Greens looked for gains but came away with profound losses, right? The reason that they lost was fundamentally about the way that preferences worked. Remember I said earlier on, preferences work differently. The reason they worked differently was because Labour had a significant swing towards them, and the preferences went that way rather than the other way. As a result of that, a lot of the people who preferred the blue after the Greens, their vote went the other way. So the Greens failed because of the preference move, and that's why in the lower house we've got Bant is sitting on the fence. I'm not sure whether he'll make it or not, but he will be the only lower house Green, or there could be 0 Greens in there. In the upper house, there will probably be 6. So they'll have quite a lot of power in the Senate. But the Senate is about horse trading, right? So remember that the Senate is about saying, well, we'll let you pass this if you give us this. So it's not a very efficient way to deal with democracy, but that's the way the Senate works. And the Senate is a house of review, and they've done some good things. They helped stop the cash ban, and they did the regional review into regional banking, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the story of the Greens. So the Greens got caught by the preference processes more than anything else.
Lots of questions here from the viewers. I want to give them the opportunity. I've just highlighted a few here. Everyone in the chat, if you can hit that like button, it really does help. I'd really appreciate it. And if you want to follow Martin's work, Martin and I started working together on the cash ban many years ago. Yeah. I often go on his channel to talk about the solution to all of this mess, and that's the solution to all of this is a layer 1. But we're having a bit of a joke.
Oh, well, we only got what was it, 53 minutes into the show. Well done.
Well, I haven't said the word yet. I'm just saying we have the solution, but of course, let's move on. But if you want to support Martin, the link's below. And head over to his channel. He's a great member of our community, and I thoroughly enjoy the work that we do together. Let's go into China, if we may. Yes. Gail has asked, have you got any opinion on what's happening with the civil unrest, perceived or actual, within China? Wizroom has said someone hacked the vote counting machines, either Labour or the Chinese. And another one has said, I'll wrap it all up into one piece. We're going to war with China, or China owns us. Look, I don't know anything. Your thoughts on China?
Okay, so let's be a little bit balanced first and say Australia is caught with 1 foot in the US and 1 foot in China. Okay, China, because of our trade relationships, which is a critical element that's actually supported the Australian economy through the last couple of decades, and through the US via its sort of political alignment and defense alignment. And the trouble is that the China-US divide is becoming wider and wider and wider. And we are caught effectively doing the splits at the moment. And Trump, I think, is trying to force people to decide whether you're going to support the US or China. Trump is making it harder for China, of course, on so many fronts. The issue is, of course, that the fallout will be a slowing economy in China, and a slowing economy then falls back to negativity in terms of the Australian economy and the ability for the Australian economy to grow. We escaped the global financial crisis because of the China measures. They did a massive amount of stimulus, and they bought a lot of stuff from us, mostly resources. Now, of course, if China needs less resources because they don't have a market in the US and they can't find other markets to sell their goods to, and they can't get their own people sufficiently enamored with the idea of buying more, then China is going to slow. So that's the sort of the broader question on China. The other side of it is they will try and stimulate their economy. They will try and redirect some of their exports, and they will continue to play hardball with the US. And in fact, the latest intelligence over the weekend was that, in fact, maybe the US and China will start talking about trade and maybe some of those tariffs will get rolled back a little bit. Who knows? So that's sort of the broad picture. The second part of this is the story of China, of course, is always told by people who have a point of view. And there are people who believe that pretty much China is bad and the US is good, and anything that China does is bad, and they don't do democracy, and they can control people, and they're doing this and that and the other. And the US is good, and everything about US is good, etc. So that's one side. There's another side that says, no, you've got to understand that the US is bad, and in fact, they've imposed their neoliberalist Western views on the rest of the world. People are now rejecting it, and through the whole BRICS and the resurgence of the global South, there's power being realigned, and China will be part of that realignment, and therefore will be effectively a capacity and a capability into the future, which is way strong. They've got a strong military, although it's nowhere near as big as the US military. But they have a lot more people, of course, which gives them a much bigger army if they want to use it. So there's a bunch of questions there. And then the question is, how much control is there in China? There's a lot of control. Interesting question. How much control is there in the US? Well, there's more control now than there was in the US. And, so I'm of the view that it's like having two very large dinosaurs that are fighting outside your cave. And then neither of them are really good. Neither of them are totally bad. And, like it or not, you've got to try and live with both of these monsters. The bottom line is, Australia needs to find its own path rather than coupling itself to one or the other. Probably can't do both. With regard to the degree of oppression within China, I think there is some oppression. They've certainly hidden some data with regard to, for example, youth unemployment and some other things, and maybe the growth numbers that they produce aren't accurate. But I'm not sure that it is as bad as some of the right-wing media have portrayed, and so it's really hard to know the truth. And if you listen to what ordinary people are saying, maybe it's a little less severe in other cases. So I can't give you a definitive view, but my point is, Australia needs to cast its own view, its own trajectory, its own future, rather than shackling itself to one or the other. Because if you do that, you're going to actually find it's really uncomfortable.
Are we allowed to form our own view? I mean, it goes back to that question: who's in charge? Like, we have, and I related to the big mining in Australia from foreign entities. I related to also when Kevin Rudd the Prime Minister at the time, tried to put a super tax on foreign companies taking precious minerals out of the ground, and he got sacked overnight. Yep. I don't say this cynically. I legitimately am not convinced that the most powerful man in the land, well, I can prove it. The most powerful person in the land is not, in fact, the Prime Minister. Our Constitution shows it's the Governor-General. So in itself, as a matter of fact. Now, in practice, we say, well, the Governor-General is ceremonial, and he or she just plays Her Excellency or His Excellency just plays their part in the background. But we've also seen historically, they have exercised their powers, and a non-elected Governor-General sacked an elected member of Parliament, the Prime Minister, I should say.
Yep.
Then we can also see them, as I mentioned, with Kevin Rudd, when he tried to put in his prime ministerial powers, he lost his job overnight. So it goes back to A, who's in charge, and B, whoever is in charge, can they change Australia if they're in the best interest for Australians?
Okay, so there's a couple of points there. The first is you've got to understand that the Treasury is in charge from one perspective, and that's from the neoliberalist philosophy that underpins everything that's done. So that's why we have a big Australia. That's why we have the tax policies that we do, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that the Treasury comes clean on a lot of this stuff. They've got some basic assumptions about the way the world works. And if you talk to Steve Keen, and he will explain to you why those Treasury officials are majorly mistaken about what they're doing. So that's the first part of it. The second part is the large corporates, of course, most of whom are not necessarily based in Australia. Look at the gas sector. We have large corporates there who are milking Australia, taking our gas and sending it overseas at significantly enhanced profit, and then charging us back at full price for the gas that we actually use. That's another example of corporates doing bad things. And again, going back to Andy, he listed a whole bunch of bad corporate behavior from supermarkets and banks and pretty much wherever you look. So the corporate sector is actually not actually necessarily working for the interests of ordinary Australians. They're working for other interests, profit predominantly, and some of that profit going offshore. That's the first angle. The second angle is that, sure, Australia is part of a global community, and of course we talk about the the liberal democracies, the freedom group or whatever you want to call it, depending on who you speak with. I don't think the freedoms that people assume are there are necessarily as free, which is a problem, firstly. And secondly, I want to come back to BRICS and the global south. If you look at the economic momentum that's happening around India, as well as China and some of the other big players, more and more, it's going to be the fact that they will be the predominant force, although they're not that well aligned. They will become perhaps more aligned over time. So they've got some vested interests too. So as to who's in charge, it depends on who you believe, I guess. But the bottom line, I would say, is that when Australia is sitting and thinking about its future, which we've hardly ever done, by the way, there was no forward-looking discussion in the policies around the last election, which should have been. Where does Australia want to be in 20 years' time? What's the nature of the society that we want to produce? What's the nature of the economy that we want to actually be part of? What are the aspirations that we have in terms of the amount of support that we provide for our communities? Those are the sorts of questions that should have been asked. And then the question is, okay, well, if we want a society where we have a bit more equality and we have a bit more social support for people, but we also have our freedoms enshrined, how do we make sure we do that? Now, those are the conversations we should have had, but those are not the conversations we did have. Rather, we kowtow to the US and we sort of kowtow to China, trade for China, the political alignment with the US. And at the end of the day, we are, well, a small cork on a very large ocean, not steering our own path. And that's the problem that I see.
I've just brought up the BRICS page. So to those who don't know, this is the antithesis to the dominance of the US dollar. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But you can see that there are many other nations that have signed up to it. It's up to about 30, actually. They're not all listed here with the image here, but power nations such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, certainly when it comes to money. But when you look at China and India and Russia and Brazil, these are powerhouses. Donald Trump has come forward and said, well, anyone who adopts BRICS, we're straight away, I think he said 100% or 200% tariffs on you, we'll show you. But I think the world is now immune per se to these tariffs, and the consequence will be like, well, if you're going to slap us,
talk.
Exactly. Agreed. I see in the hey, we're past the hour mark, so now I'm going to say the word. You've got three major currencies that are now competing with each other. Here we go. Let's have some fun. The US dollar, BRICS, and Bitcoin. US dollar is a money of war. BRICS
we should have a bell you should ring every time you say Bitcoin.
I've had some of my subs actually say it. They said it for me. Ramsey's out there. He put in Bitcoin for me. We're past the hour mark, so I can throw it in there. Look, you and I have spoken at length about this. I talk about the layer one solution to all of it is money. Whether you are for your family or for your church or for your sporting club or for yourself, it's all about money. You need to be able to live. And if money is broken, we need to fix that. I'm wondering that, when we see in Australia, who do we side with? And that's what we're really talking about here. Do we side with America? Well, on paper, absolutely. Do we side with China? Well, they're a major customer of ours. Do we side with the mining companies? Well, they've got a lot of lobbying power. Do we side with the banks, or do we side with the people? Now that we've got a lot of immigration coming in, we were always taught that multiculturalism and diversity is really good, and maybe that's true. But I've lived all around the world, Martin, and I've actually found that I have to be careful with my words here. Some of the most powerful nations and succinct nations and symbiotic nations that I've lived in, not just visited, but lived in, monoculture nations or uniculture nations, a term I'm just making up here. I'm not saying multiculturalism is good or bad. I'm just saying that I've seen a lot more synergy and less friction and less crime in nations such as Japan and Korea, which are very much monoculture nations. But maybe I'm completely wrong, and we'll see that Australia will be the most symbiotic and calm and aligned nation. Also, when I lived in the United States, I saw many different cultures in there, and that seemed to create some tensions amongst some people. I'm not entirely sure who has the right opinion on all of this, but I do have a question here. I know you want to answer, but I'm going to weave this in here. Someone's asked us, Pulse Chain Trainer. He says, if they start to tax unrealized gains in Australia, would you leave the country? Well, Martin's already gone. He bailed a couple of years ago, so Martin's over in the UK. He's a British citizen. We're actually both British citizens, but I suppose the question is put to me: if the biggest expense in my life now is my government, it's not my home, it's not my living expenses, it's my government. The most expensive thing in my life is paying the government. So if they're now going to tax my retirement, money that I've already been taxed on, and now I'm going to be taxed on my retirement, it's getting to the position where I don't feel my government likes me. I think they're not really big on straight white men. I think there's been a big push to straight white men bad. Perceived or actual, that's just my perception. I can see that as a veteran, I think I've been treated very poorly by the system. I think that I can substantiate that with a royal commission into how veterans are treated. We can see that you are something like 200 times more likely as someone who served your country to die coming back from war than going to war. So really think about that. As an Australian who's serving your country, it is in fact statistically, factually more dangerous coming out of a war zone back to your own country. You are more likely to die coming back to your own country than moving into a war zone. That is a statistical fact. Moving on from even the Second World War, Vietnam War, a lot of suicides, Korean War, a lot of suicides, Afghanistan, Iraq, immense amount of suicides. So I'm not actually convinced my government likes me. I don't think they hate me. I just don't think they really care about me. So it gets to the point where if I'm spending so much money to support an entity that despises me or doesn't think anything of me, I'm like, well, no hard feelings. Thanks for the ride. Shake hands and move out of there. But it seems that now there's going to be a bloody an exit tax. So even if I want to leave, it's like, well, we're going to get you for that. I've set the stage. Your thoughts?
Two things. The first is the deficit means that taxes have to go up. There is no intent from government, particularly the Labour government, to reduce the deficit ahead. And whilst they got a little bit of movement to the positive for 2 years, the third year not, and now they're projecting that there will be further deficits out. Remember, of course, that they are actually handing more money out through electricity subsidies and et cetera, right? So they are going to need to find more ways to tax. Of course, they've already frozen the income bands, so the tax income bands, which means that basically as you earn more, you get taxed more, and there's no intent of unfreezing it. And they're still looking for more. That's why the unrealized capital gains thing has come to the fore. And there's a chance that they will do it beyond superannuation. I don't know whether if you think, what about taxing the unrealized gains in Bitcoin, right? How about that? That would be quite fun, wouldn't it? That could change the game. So that they need more money. The reason they need more money is because they're blooming inefficient at what they do. And there's masses and masses and masses of duplication and masses of waste in the way that the government works. And that's a combination of state and federal and duplication, et cetera. So in a way, the DOGE intent from the US is sort of right. There is a lot of waste. The question is, does anybody in government want to tackle it? Does Treasury want to tackle it? Not really. It's much easier just to put your taxes up a bit more. Now, the problem we've got, of course, is that the question is, well, where does Australia appear vis-a-vis taxes? Because, of course, it depends a little bit on whether you include in your tax calculation the mandatory superannuation payments. If you include them, then it's sort of we're pretty up there. And there was a recent OECD report that showed that the amount of tax that we were paying in Australia was in the middle of the pack, but towards the upper end. And that's, I think, this is a slide here. There you go, which show that the high tax burden sits more in the middle. But it depends on whether if you add superannuation in, we're right in the middle of the OECD of the overall tax burden. You probably should include that or not. So that's where we are at the moment. And my point is that there was going to be a need to increase taxation even further in the years ahead, unless there's a fundamental strategic change in terms of what governments do and what they spend money on. Of course, they're also talking about increasing defense spending because of the international situation, et cetera, et cetera. And that's another reason why I believe that migration will stay high, because, of course, more people means more people to pay taxes. So that's so a very inefficient process and very significant. The second point to take is that if you actually believe that you want a big government that has its fingers in more pies and it gets to do more stuff, then you're going to have to pay more for it. And if you look at some of the Scandinavian countries, they have quite high taxes, but they do a lot more in terms of government services. So it does come back to a question of what do you want governments to do? And that takes you right back to neoliberalism. Do you want the market to drive everything? Or do you want to actually have interventions from governments? And, it's interesting that Dutton was talking about government intervention in areas that haven't had it before, like nuclear, for example, and some of the other things too. Albo's talking about government intervention in the lender's mortgage insurance quasi story when the 5% deposit. So what do you want governments to do? Right? How much more do you want governments to actually, spend on our behalf? Now, unfortunately, the accountabilities are so bad and the efficiency of government is so poor that my view has always been that big government is not necessarily a good thing. There are some things where you probably do want government. So I think there should be a government bank. I think there should be a bank that effectively invests in infrastructure in Australia. I think there's a case for a government bank where people can put their savings safely and can also do it without charging a huge profit, because, of course, the banks make a lot of money. Their margins are much higher than most other banks around the world. So there are things that government probably should do, but that's the question. We haven't had that question asked, right, or answered, though we should have. What about healthcare? Do you want healthcare in the public sector? Should it all be public? That's what the Medicare card, etc. Or should it be more private? And if it's private, what does that mean? So there's a bunch of consequential decisions that you take about what's right to put in the pot and outside the pot of government funded, government supported. And the other side of that is the more you put in the pot, the more the taxes you have to pay. And, Adam, are you getting value from the taxes you pay? What do you think?
Well, gosh. So here's the thing. I drive on roads, but my registration pays for those roads. I rarely use the medical system because I remain healthy, but that's not to say that I wouldn't need the medical system. I enjoy, I think, the security of the military. So we need military. Policing, it's nothing against the police, but I think their hands are tied with when it comes to criminal activity. It's a great question. It really is a good question. What am I getting? Like once you start paying 6 figures a quarter and then 7 figures a year, it's like, well, what am I getting here? Like, really? It's like, and then when you work even harder, it's like, well, now you've got to give us even more. And it's like, I guess I got to bail. Like, at what, I do a thought experiment. Let's get into philosophical examples. I'm going to use a movie theater as an example. So in the olden days, you go to a movie theater and you'd pay, I don't know, $5 for a ticket. And what did you get for the $5? Well, you got a seat, you got a great sound system, you got a big screen, and you got to watch the latest movie. But now that I haven't been to movies for years, why would I go? And what do I get? So I paid $20 and I've got to sit next to a stranger. It's not as good as and as comfortable as my own lounge room and my own big screen and my own sound system. And then I have to watch a ideological movie that says white men bad, watch this girl power. This is how it is. I'm like, yeah, I don't really get any value for this anymore, so I don't go to the movies anymore. And then when you relate that to your life in any nation, it's like, right, we don't really like you. We're going to accuse you of being all of these things, and we're going to silence you, and we're going to make everything around you so expensive. And by the way, you've now got to pay us more money. And we're going to take away your freedom of speech through the MAD bill, and we're going to take away your right to use cash. And we're going to have a referendum that says now there's 2 groups of people, even though we all want to be equal. And it's like, yeah, what am I paying for? So I'm happy with paying taxes. I've got no issue with paying taxes. The issue I've got, and you just touched on it, is what are your taxes used for? And the biggest expense in Australia is so we've got all these departments in Australia, and most people think that the biggest expense is defence. And you'd think it was defence, over 100,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen, landholders of an area bigger than Belgium, biggest real estate owner in the Southern Hemisphere. Think of all the jets, the bombs, the bullets, the planes, the people, the wages, the uniforms, the bases, the infrastructure, the electricity bill, all of it. And it does not equal the cost to the Department of Human Services. And the cost within the Department of Human Services are, of course, your retirees, cool. Disabled people, cool. But then a huge cost is also to those who choose not to work. And I make that very clear distinction. In Australia, I'm very proud of a system where we can support those who can't work. They're disabled, they're old, they're broken or whatever. Cool, what a great society we have. But it's now moved into a position, it's like, hey, who doesn't want to work, right? You don't want to work? Okay, all of you people who work and sacrifice and labor away and produce value for the economy, your punishment for doing that is we're going to take more of your money so we can fund the people who choose not to work. Now, in a village in the olden days, those people who chose not to work, they'd be ostracized from the village. And those who work the hardest, they would be elevated to the top. Well, now it's kind of the opposite. Now it's like, well, those who work the hardest, we're going to punish you the most. You're going to pay the most. And those of you who choose not to work, we're going to reward you the most. You get free medical, free housing, free transport, free money, free take your pick. And it's like, yeah, I'm trying to pull away a bit. Your thoughts?
Well, we discussed last time, I think, the Laffer curve, right? Which is effectively to say there is a point at which when you put the tax rates up even more, you actually don't get any further contribution of tax. What you find is that people move away or they find ways to get around paying tax, etc., etc. So I think we're quite close to that sort of point at which if they go further with taxes, then people are going to actually start voting with their feet and doing other things. That's the first point. Second point is they will look to expand the tax base. That's why this idea of taxing unrealized gains, I saw there was a question in the chat, is, it's not a bogeyman. It's being done elsewhere in other countries. And it's a relatively recent development. And it's a way of governments trying to find additional sources of revenue because they need it. The final point to say is that when you look at the expenditure base, a lot, of course, is to do with NDIS and all of those things. And of course, we want support for people who are really in need of it in a society. But is everybody who's actually classified as needing support really needing support? Are there classifications now being used which are bringing way more people into this situation where they can claim and get support? Remember that most of the expansion in employment in recent times has been in the public sector or a public sector by proxy, meaning it's private players providing healthcare services, for example, or social services paid for by the government indirectly. So all of those things suggest that we are getting to somewhat limits in terms of, what we can do and where our money goes to. And like I say, Labour won't want to actually spend less. Labour will want to spend more, which means that effectively they're going to have to put taxes up, which means they're going to have to find more ways of taxing or indeed lifting the rates at which taxes are being paid. And I expect to see more of that, particularly at the top end. And the unrealized gains is a real thing. It's not just now, as Tina actually just put up there, and this is a really important point, but what about the corporates? The corporates are paying much less than they should. And if you go back over the last 20 to 30 years, there's more and more tax avoidance from corporates. You do it offshore, you shift assets around, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, in some cases, as you mentioned before, when we had certain taxes imposed on certain corporates, they then kicked up a big fuss and they were basically resources rent tax, for example, basically kicked up a fuss and then it was taken away again. So the truth is that the corporate sector is not paying their fair share, which is part of the problem. And more of the support for the government in Australia is coming through individual taxation. And we're getting to the point where it's not feasible to increase it much further without significant pain. And yet, that's what we're going to do.
Just a bit more admin. Someone by the name of Mick, M-I-K-K, I banned you because of your filthy, disgusting words. If you are unable to communicate like a human without throwing disgusting slurs and filthy language into the comments, I will ban you immediately. If you want to speak like an adult and like a human being, try to drop the filthy language and just communicate. If you can't do that, you're not welcome here. What we can see now is that people are, there's a bit of a brain drain in Australia. You're an example of it, a great contributor to this nation, and you left us, Martin, but I can see that you're still so very much committed to this nation. Is life better over in the UK than what you're experiencing in the past in Australia? Did you make the right move?
Well, going back to my personal circumstances, one of the reasons I moved was because I'd lost my wife, and I couldn't countenance staying where I was, living in the same house, and decided at that point, well, maybe I should move back to an area of the country in the UK where I've got family and friends, and it's proved to be a good move for me personally. In terms of my economics, it's actually worked out quite well. So the cost of groceries are about roughly half, give or take, of what it was in Australia when I left. That's even worse now. And the costs of housing roughly similar, maybe slightly cheaper here relative to Australia. So it swings and roundabouts. Internet, I've told you the story before. Internet, a tenth of the costs here for the same high quality connection that I had in Australia. So the NBN didn't do me any favors in Australia. So net financially, I'm better off by being here rather than Australia. I spent 30 odd years in Australia and feel very much part of Australia, and I'm still an Australian citizen, and believe passionately that Australia has a huge positive potential future, but only if things change. And this past election has shown me once again that the politicians have no intention of moving the dial to tackle the things that need to be thought about. And that's the problem. So we're in this bind where we have an Australian society going down the gurgler, swamped by migration, swamped by high taxation, and little real intent to solve the issues. That's the problem we've got. Now, there is an alternative, and that alternative is there for the taking, but there's no appetite from the politicians to want to deal with it. Why? Because they're quite comfortable with the way things are, with their portfolio of investment properties, et cetera, et cetera. They're quite comfortable with the donations they get from big corporates for influence or not influence, depending on who you talk to. They are quite happy not understanding how much of the population is currently very much under the gun. And I keep coming back to this point. It's not like everybody in Australia is feeling great about things and feeling they've got plenty of money and feel that their cost of living pressures are under control. No, a lot of people are struggling, and they've continued to struggle and will continue to struggle. And there's nothing in this latest round, politically speaking, that is casting anything like a new direction for the country. Where's the productivity discussion? Where is the discussion about building a better industrial base in Australia? I mean, there are so many things I could go through. So that's the point. So, we are at a bit of a crossroads. Unfortunately, this election, to my mind, missed a significant opportunity. Labour's in with a large majority. They will continue to peddle the same old, and marginally will do things but won't do anything dramatic. They won't do tax reform. They won't do productivity improvement. So what does that tell you about the future?
Someone's asked a good question that Benjamin said, can I get a tax return on unrealized losses? So it's a really good question, and I've thought about it as well. So there's been discussion about taxing unrealized gains, that is taxing money that you haven't accessed. But if you've got unrealized losses, can I claim that on my tax return? And I'll take it a step further, Martin. I would like to see, the world according to me, is that I would like to see inflation as a tax deduction. So if you've inflated the money supply by 5%, I want a 5% return on my tax return.
Well, that would be great. Yeah, look, the truth is that it depends a little bit, but most people who have looked at this suggesting that they are not necessarily going to give you a credit if assets go down, because of course that would actually then negate the whole concept of what they were trying to do in the first place. So it might be a one-way street, or it might be a two-way street, but the fact is that the proposals were very flaky when they came out a couple of years ago. They were blocked in the Parliament. They'll probably bring them back.
We're coming up to the 1 hour and a half mark. The chat is melting. A lot of great questions in there. There's a question to me that I litter everywhere says, Adam, what about the police Adam. He says, far poorer people finance the police force that protect you from the far poorer people. Poorer people get nothing from police, only fines and beatings. Look, you've asked a question. I disagree with it. I don't believe that poor people only get fines and beatings. But equally, I don't feel protected by the police. I can give many examples, and it's nothing against the police. I think it's that the police are under-resourced, and I think that the police have their hands held. It's really about the laws when people are arrested. I'll give an example. I had someone steal something from my house a while ago, and I rang up the police and I said, "Look, someone's broken in," and they said to me, "Is it worth more than $500?" And I said, "Probably not on the open market." And they said, "Well, we're not going to do anything." And it just made me realize that was the opposite of what you're saying there, Litter Everywhere. That was basically a free get out of jail free card. We didn't even go to jail. If you are going to commit a crime against Australian citizens, according to the police, the Australian Federal Police, as long as it's under $500, you're good to go. And I'm like, what? Like, what type of foundation do we take in a society for that? So, and equally, when it comes to getting fines, if you are speeding in a car, anyone will get a fine, whether you're poor or rich. And when it comes to police beating poorer people, I don't know if you're in Australia or not. Look, I disagree. I support the police. I like the police. I just think that they themselves are held hostage to whatever the lawmakers make. They say, well, if we're not going to go to court for anything under $500, the cops have their hands are held tied. Equally, if they are under-resourced and can't respond to incidents, that's not their fault. That's the funders' fault. Super chat straight here from Ramsey. He says, Martin, curious, but you have heard of have you heard from John Adams? And are you continuing in the interest of the peoples? Yeah, so by way of background, Martin North and John Adams did some really good series in the interest of the people, and Ramsey's asking about it. What's going on with John?
Yeah, I spoke with John yesterday, actually. He's still around. He's on another quest at the moment, doing a few other things, and isn't so engaged with the political process or the economic processes that we were covering previously. That may come to an end. If it does, then John and I will still make some more shows. That channel is really dedicated to what John and I were up to. I'm continuing my fight with regard to some of these broader issues, these philosophical issues on my channel and on this one, and anywhere else I can get talk about. So there's probably no immediate plans for John to come back on the interest of the people, but never say never. And like I said, I spoke with him yesterday, and he's well, and he's busy doing other things at the moment.
If you didn't have a British background and you were looking to live somewhere else, where would you have gone?
Difficult decision. Yeah. So, I had experience of living in a number of different countries, US, New Zealand, quite a few Asian countries, and a couple of, I think if I had complete unfettered choice, one of the Scandinavian countries would probably be one of the ones that I think would probably be where I'd probably end up. They seem to be happier. They probably pay more tax, but there is a societal norm that I see there that I don't see in the UK or in Australia, or indeed the US. So that's probably where I'd look. Somebody said Poland. I actually spent some time working in Poland, and there's some great things about Poland, but there are also some very worrying things about Poland. So wouldn't quite pass muster. But some of the Scandinavian countries, I think, probably have the recipe more right. Interestingly, one of the things that they focus very much on is well-being, and I think that's something that we could very much focus on.
Down under Dover says Russia. I've looked at South American countries or Latin countries, simply because I speak Spanish and it's pretty cheap to live there. I also thoroughly enjoyed Korea. It's just a little bit too dirty for me. Not a really good sanitation system. Thoroughly enjoyed Japan, but Japan's a mega clean country. But I don't speak Japanese, and when I was in Tokyo for a long time, it got pretty full on in the subway system, and it was pretty busy, but a high trust society. And I think there's so many great nations around the world. I've also lived in America, but America was good. The guns concern me. I've even spoken to partners in the past saying, would you come and live in America? And they said, no, because I don't want to be shot. Now, whether that's perceived or actual danger.
Can I say there's no such thing as a perfect place to live?
I concur.
There'll
Absolutely.
always be compromises, right? So it's a question of
Absolutely.
what's important to you and to your family. What do you want to trade off? That's the question you've got to ask yourself.
Yeah. Ramsey says thank you for answering his question. And YouTuber user says, I agree, Scandinavian countries are absolutely gorgeous. Some of the most beautiful countries in the world, in my opinion, but pretty expensive. But some good services there as well. As you said, that there's no perfect country out there. Skynet says, how about ride the technology wave and just live in a remote area, full self-sufficiency? You can never live completely off the grid. I found Skynet. Skynet's a much loved member of the community, but I give the example of this guy who's living in Canada. He was living off the land. He didn't want to trouble anyone. He went and lived on public land, and there was a helicopter doing like a fire patrol, and they saw a little bit of smoke coming out from his campsite, and they arrested him. And he goes, I'm not even doing anything. It's like, no, you can't live here. This is a national park. And he's like, yeah, but I want to live off the grid. And it just made me realize you can't ever actually live completely off the grid.
No, like it or not, we are part of this human machine, right? And this human machine requires people to be tethered to a particular society in a particular location for tax purposes and everything else, right? That's just the nature of the beast. I'm not sure you can go completely off-piste.
It is true, my friend. So I've brought up your site here, Walk the World. If people, first of all, great conversation tonight. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Unfortunately, Martin, I feel more stressed now than before we started.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, it's because you always make us face the hard truths, the reality here. So this is your site, Walk the World. A plug to the people out there for yourself.
Yeah, so I've got a few sites. The Walk the World Universe is the one that takes you into the financial management aspects with Nucleus Wealth. I've also, of course, got my digital finance analytics.com site and my Walk the World YouTube channel, which is not this one, but actually on YouTube, where I actually make shows daily on finance and property, and have covered a lot of the different things that we've been talking about here tonight, and specifically refer you back to that show that I published yesterday. It got a massive response. Just to put it back up, if I may, a bigger, more taxed, less housed Australia incoming, because there in about 5 or 6 minutes, I tried to sum up what I thought based on the results that we had from the election, and tried to sort of highlight some of the strategic issues. The point is, and this is a good closeout point, there is a significant strategic opportunity for Australia to really thrive and prosper, but only if we do things differently. And unfortunately, this last election has shown me that there's no appetite to do things differently. It's going to be the same old, which is a worry, because if we continue to go down the same road, we're going to end up with higher cost housing. We're going to end up with more people struggling to get by. We're going to end up with the corporates making more money off us and more taxes being paid. And I don't think that's great for the future of Australia or Australians. So it's a question of choice. Unfortunately, I think the choice we made this time probably won't lead us in good fettle down the road.
A couple of people just said on the off the grid. Woodsy says, I'm off grid, Starlink connected. I do need to move every now and then, but it's doable in New South Wales. Slick Dick says, Down Under says, off grid on my 7.5 acres. Look, to Down Under Drover, you've had some great comments here, but you're not off grid entirely because you've got to pay rates. And even if you own the land, you've got to pay rates. And Woodsy, you say you're off the grid, but you've got a Starlink connected, and there you go. You're paying your Starlink fee. So this is an example. You're never truly off the grid. I own the land. No, you've got to pay the rates. No, I just roam around in a caravan. Well, you've got to pay for fuel and your Starlink fee. So you're never truly off unless you're, I guess, just walking through the forest randomly. But Martin,
yeah, I must tell you, I get the most pleasure from just walking in the countryside. And I'm lucky here. I've got a lot of countryside around me. And, put aside all of the shenanigans, all of the election, everything else. Take some time to get out and enjoy nature, right? Because that is, for me, the most critical piece of advice I'd give anyone in the current environment. Don't get too stressed about it. Chill out, enjoy nature, right? Get close to nature, because there you will see things differently, and you'll feel better for doing it.
Stephen Covey, author of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, would agree with you. He talks about sharpening the saw, and sharpening the saw is part of that is resetting. He talks about getting into nature, putting your feet in sand or into the ocean, whatever it is, just break away. And I think it's a great way to close the show. And I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to take my dogs for a walk by the river. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics and Walk the World and your own channel. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Take care.